There's a specific image most people carry in their head when they hear the words Library of Alexandria. A single terrible night, flames climbing the marble columns, thousands of scrolls turning to ash in a matter of hours, while scholars scream and Roman soldiers watch. An entire civilization's worth of knowledge, gone before sunrise. It's one of the most repeated tragedies in Western history. Julius Caesar, 48 BC. The fire that erased the ancient world's greatest repository of learning in one catastrophic moment. None of it is quite right. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in a single fire. It was destroyed at least 4 times over the span of nearly 400 years by 4 completely different people, some of whom weren't even trying to destroy it. Caesar's famous fire probably didn't burn the main library at all. The version most people know, the one where a Christian mob torched it to the ground in 391 AD, is contradicted by every contemporary source we still have. And the story that a Muslim caliph finished the job by using the scrolls to heat public baths is almost certainly a fabrication invented centuries after the fact. The real story of how the Library of Alexandria died is stranger, quieter, and considerably more disturbing than the one you've been told. It involves emperors, tsunamis, forgotten massacres, and a slow-motion collapse most people have never heard of. And the actual killer wasn't fire at all. To understand how the library was lost, you first have to understand what it actually was, because most of what people imagine about it is wrong, starting with the building itself. Alexandria was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great on a coastal strip of Egypt where the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander himself barely spent any time there. He marked out the city's boundaries, allegedly using grain from his soldiers' rations because he had no chalk on hand, and then left almost immediately to continue his conquests further east. He never saw a single building of Alexandria completed. When he died 8 years later in Babylon at the age of 32, the city that bore his name was still under construction. His empire fractured almost overnight among the generals who had followed him. Egypt fell to a general named Ptolemy, who took the country not by right of birth or divine mandate, but by simply grabbing it while everyone else was distracted fighting over the more glamorous prizes further east. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh. He founded a dynasty, and he faced a problem every foreign ruler in Egypt's history has faced. How does a Greek-speaking outsider convince 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization to accept him as legitimate? Ptolemy's answer was ambition on a scale nobody had ever attempted. He would make Alexandria not just a capital, but the intellectual center of the known world. And to do that, he and his son Ptolemy II launched what were essentially 2 twin projects designed to broadcast Egyptian greatness to every visiting foreigner, sailor, and diplomat who set foot in the harbor. The first was the lighthouse. The pharaohs of Alexandria stood roughly 100 meters tall, comparable to a modern 30-story building, and it remained the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 1,000 years until it was finally toppled by a series of earthquakes in the 14th century. Ships approaching the Egyptian coast could see it burning long before they could see the shoreline itself. It was an engineering marvel and a piece of pure political theater. The message was unmistakable. Whatever you thought Egypt was, look again. The second project was less visible from the sea, but ultimately far more ambitious. The library. Here's the detail almost nobody gets right about what the library actually was. It wasn't just a building where scrolls were stored. It was one component of a much larger institution called the Mouseion, literally the House of the Muses, which is where the modern word museum comes from, though the ancient meaning was closer to what we'd now call a research university. Scholars lived on site, paid by the Ptolemaic crown, provided with food and lodging in exchange for producing new work. There were lecture halls, botanical gardens, a zoo containing exotic animals from across 3 continents, astronomical observatories, dissection rooms where physicians studied human anatomy at a level that wouldn't be equaled in Europe for another 1,500 years. The library itself was the part of this complex that housed the written knowledge, and the scale of that collection is where the story starts to become genuinely staggering. Ancient sources estimate somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 individual scrolls at the collection's peak. Modern historians tend to prefer the lower figure, but even that number is difficult to comprehend when you understand how they were acquired. The Ptolemies didn't just buy scrolls. They implemented what might be the most audacious book collection scheme in recorded history. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched, not for smuggled goods, but for texts. Any scroll found on board was confiscated by the crown, copied by scribes working in the library itself, and returned to the owner. Sometimes, the owner got the copy. The library kept the original. This practice was so aggressive it earned its own name in the ancient world. Scholars called them the ship books, texts that arrived in the city as private property and left, if they left at all, as duplicates. Some ships never even got their copies back, when the Ptolemies decided the original was too valuable to return under any circumstances. By the time the library reached its peak in the 2nd century BC, it was almost certainly the largest concentration of written knowledge that had ever existed in one place. Which is exactly what made the events that followed so catastrophic, even though, as you're about to see, almost none of them happened the way you've been told. The first of the 4 destructions is the one everybody thinks they know about: Julius Caesar, 48 BC, the famous fire that supposedly erased the ancient world's greatest library in a single night. The real story is considerably more complicated, and the moment you look closely at it, the myth starts falling apart in your hands. Caesar didn't come to Alexandria to burn anything. He arrived in October of 48 BC chasing a defeated enemy. His former ally turned rival, Pompey the Great, had lost the Battle of Pharsalus a few months earlier and fled to Egypt hoping for sanctuary. He found none. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, calculating that presenting Caesar with the head of his greatest enemy would earn him Roman favor, had Pompey murdered on the beach before Caesar's ships even landed. Caesar was reportedly not pleased. Pompey had been his son-in-law and a fellow Roman consul. Killing him was a political catastrophe that would have to be handled carefully back in Rome, and Caesar had wanted the credit for capturing him alive. Instead, he found himself handed a severed head by a 14-year-old boy king he immediately distrusted. What happened next is where the library legend actually begins. Caesar decided to intervene in the Egyptian civil war that was tearing the Ptolemaic dynasty apart, specifically by backing Ptolemy XIII's older sister, a 21-year-old woman named Cleopatra VII. That decision trapped him in Alexandria for 6 months, badly outnumbered, cut off from reinforcements, fighting Egyptian forces in the streets of the very city he was supposed to be governing. At one critical moment, with Egyptian ships preparing to launch from the harbor and cut off Caesar's escape route entirely, he did something desperate. He ordered the ships in Alexandria's harbor set on fire, hoping to destroy the Egyptian fleet before it could sail. The fire worked. It also spread. Wind carried the flames from the harbor ships to the wooden warehouses lining the docks. And here's where the ancient sources start to disagree in ways that matter enormously. Plutarch, writing about 150 years after the event, claimed the fire spread inland and consumed the entire library. Cassius Dio, writing even later, said a great number of fine books were destroyed. Livy, whose original account is lost, but was quoted by later writers, put the number at 40,000 scrolls burned. But other ancient writers who lived closer to the event don't mention any library damage at all. Caesar himself wrote a detailed account of the Alexandrian War, an entire book about exactly this campaign, and never mentioned burning a library. Cicero, corresponding with people in Alexandria within a few years of the event, never brought it up. Strabo, the Greek geographer who visited Alexandria roughly 20 years after Caesar's fire, described the Mouseion as still functioning normally, with scholars in residence and the collection intact. Modern historians have pieced together what most likely actually happened, and the picture that emerges is far less dramatic than the myth. The 40,000 scrolls Livy mentioned were probably stored not in the main library itself, but in dockside warehouses. Either texts recently confiscated from ships awaiting cataloging, or duplicates being prepared for export to a secondary collection. The fire almost certainly destroyed these warehouse stocks, It probably did not touch the main library building, which sat deeper in the city, in the royal quarter, well away from the harbor. That's still a loss. 40,000 scrolls is a catastrophic amount of writing to lose in a single night, and there's no way to know what irreplaceable works burned along with the more routine texts. But it's not the loss of the library. It's more like losing a major branch warehouse of a much larger institution. Devastating in the moment, but not civilizationally fatal. The reason we know this is because the library continued functioning after Caesar left Alexandria. Cleopatra, whose relationship with Caesar produced a son and whose subsequent relationship with Mark Antony was arguably even more consequential, remained actively involved with the Mouseion for the next 18 years of her reign. When Antony later gave her a wedding gift, according to the historian Plutarch, it consisted of 200,000 scrolls looted from the rival library of Pergamon. A gift that only makes sense if the Alexandrian library still existed and still needed replenishing. The fire of 48 BC damaged the collection. It did not destroy the institution. That would take another 250 years, and the next major blow would come from a source almost nobody today has ever heard of. The second destruction happened in 215 AD, and the man responsible is one of the most peculiar villains in Roman history. His name was Caracalla, and to call him unstable is being generous to the historical record. By the early 3rd century, Egypt had been a Roman province for over 200 years. Alexandria was still one of the great cities of the empire, probably second only to Rome itself in population, wealth, and cultural prestige. The Mouseion still functioned. The library still held its collection, though certainly diminished from its Ptolemaic peak. Scholars still traveled from across the Mediterranean to study there. Caracalla became emperor in 211, at the age of 22, after arranging the murder of his younger brother Geta in front of their own mother. That detail matters because it establishes the pattern of everything that followed. He was violent, paranoid, and, even by Roman imperial standards, remarkably thin-skinned. The Alexandrians, unfortunately for them, had a reputation across the ancient world for something that would prove catastrophic when applied to Caracalla. They were famously, incorrigibly funny. Alexandrian comedy, Alexandrian satire, Alexandrian street humor. All of it was renowned throughout the Mediterranean for a specific kind of savage wit that respected no authority whatsoever. Roman writers who visited the city complained about it constantly. You couldn't walk through the marketplace without hearing yourself or your associates mocked in verses that were often, by all accounts, genuinely clever. When Caracalla visited Alexandria in 215 AD, the citizens couldn't help themselves. They wrote comic verses about the fratricide. They performed satirical plays lampooning his relationship with his mother, which Roman gossip had already suggested was inappropriately close. They made jokes about his short stature, his affected imitation of Alexander the Great, his obvious insecurities. All of it, according to the historian Cassius Dio, delivered with the kind of casual brilliance that Alexandrian humor was famous for. Caracalla did not find it funny. He announced a great honor. He would review all the young men of the city in a massive assembly, personally conscripting the strongest for his army. Thousands of Alexandrian youths gathered in the designated plain, believing they were participating in a routine imperial ceremony. What Caracalla actually ordered was a massacre. Roman soldiers surrounded the crowd on his signal and began killing them. Ancient sources describe the slaughter continuing for hours, then days. Cassius Dio, writing not long after the events, put the death toll at close to 25,000. An entire generation of young Alexandrian men murdered in retaliation for jokes. Modern historians consider that figure inflated, but agree the actual number ran into the tens of thousands. Then Caracalla turned his attention to the Mouseion itself. He didn't burn it. He didn't need to. He simply abolished the scholarly community that had operated inside it for 500 years. The stipends paid to resident scholars, the funding that had drawn intellectuals to Alexandria from every corner of the empire since the reign of Ptolemy I, were terminated by imperial decree. The privileges the Mouseion's members had held, including exemption from certain taxes and legal obligations, were revoked. Foreign scholars living in the complex were expelled from the city entirely. Take a moment with what that actually means. The library building probably still stood. The scrolls, most of them, were probably still on their shelves. But the institution that surrounded the library, that had given it purpose, that had staffed it with the scholars who copied and preserved and expanded the collection, that institution ceased to exist by imperial order. Books need people. A library without librarians, without scholars, without an active community of readers and copyists, isn't really a library anymore. It's a warehouse full of decaying paper waiting for time to finish the job. And papyrus is not durable. Under ideal conditions, cool, dry, protected from insects and rodents and mold, a papyrus scroll might last 200 or 300 years before it becomes too brittle to unroll. Under Alexandria's actual conditions, which included Mediterranean humidity and the constant threat of the Nile flooding, the working lifespan of a single scroll was more likely 50 to 100 years. The entire premise of the library depended on continuous copying, new scrolls made from old ones before the old ones crumbled into dust. Caracalla's decree in 215 AD didn't destroy the collection. It did something quieter, and in the long run, more thorough. It removed the people who kept the collection alive. 60 years later, another emperor would arrive in Alexandria for entirely different reasons. And what remained of the library would take its third catastrophic hit. The third destruction came in 273 AD, and this one arrived from a direction the Ptolemies never could have anticipated. It didn't come from Rome, it came from the Syrian desert. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was falling apart in ways that would have seemed impossible 100 years earlier. Historians now call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 50 years during which the empire cycled through more than 20 emperors, most of them murdered by their own armies, while barbarian invasions pressed against every frontier and entire provinces broke away to declare independence. One of those breakaway provinces was Palmyra, a wealthy trading city in what's now Syria. Its queen, Zenobia, seized on Rome's weakness to build something remarkable. A short-lived empire stretching from Anatolia through Syria and Egypt and reaching almost to the Bosporus. For a few years in the early 200s and 70s, she effectively ruled the entire eastern half of the Roman world from her palace in Palmyra. Alexandria fell under her control in 270 AD. The Alexandrians, based on their historical pattern of political flexibility, seem to have accepted her rule without much resistance. Zenobia herself was reportedly interested in Greek scholarship and may have even patronized what remained of the Mouseion during her brief period of control. Then Rome sent Aurelian. The Emperor Aurelian was, by any measure, one of the most militarily effective rulers Rome ever produced. In just 5 years on the throne, he reunified an empire that had seemed on the verge of permanent dissolution. He crushed the Gallic succession in the west. He defeated Zenobia's forces in a series of brutal campaigns across the eastern provinces. And when he arrived in Alexandria in 273 AD to reassert direct Roman control, the city made the same mistake it had made with Caracalla 60 years earlier. It resisted. The exact sequence of events is disputed by ancient sources, but the general shape is clear enough. Alexandrians, loyal to what remained of Zenobia's cause, fortified themselves in the Mouseion, the royal quarter of the city, the same district that contained the palace complex, the Mouseion, and the library. Aurelian's forces besieged them there. The Mouseion did not survive the siege. Ancient sources describe the destruction as comprehensive. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing about a century later, noted that the royal quarter of Alexandria was still visibly ruined in his own time. Walls left standing but hollowed out, palaces reduced to stone shells, entire streets abandoned to weeds and rubble. The Mouseion never recovered its former grandeur. It remained a wasteland at the heart of Alexandria for centuries, and the Mouseion, sitting inside the Mouseion, went down with the rest of it. Whether the library building itself burned, collapsed, or was simply looted and stripped by the besieging army isn't precisely documented. What is documented is that after 273 AD, the Mouseion effectively disappears from historical record. Later writers who describe Alexandria's intellectual life mention scholars, mention libraries in the plural sense, mention centers of learning still functioning in the city, but the specific institution founded by Ptolemy I, the one that had housed the great collection since the 3rd century BC, is gone. Whatever had survived Caesar's fire in 48 BC and Caracalla's abolition of scholarly stipends in 215 AD didn't survive Aurelian's siege. Here's the part worth paying attention to, though. Alexandria was not without books after 273 AD. The daughter library at the Serapeum, a smaller collection housed in a temple complex on a hill in a different part of the city, still existed. Private libraries owned by wealthy Alexandrians still existed. Christian communities were beginning to build their own libraries in monasteries and churches across the region. Roman North Africa still had functioning centers of learning at Carthage and elsewhere. The intellectual world of the Mediterranean didn't end when the Mouseion burned. But something specific and irreplaceable did end. The single greatest concentrated collection of ancient learning that had ever been assembled, the institution that had preserved and generated knowledge continuously for over 500 years, ceased to function as a unified whole. What remained after 273 AD was scattered, pieces of the original collection copied and dispersed across other libraries, individual works surviving in private hands, but never again gathered into anything like the Mouseion had been. And then, less than a century later, something arrived that nobody in Alexandria had planned for. It didn't come by land, didn't wear a Roman uniform, didn't announce itself with a proclamation. It came from the sea. The third destruction came in 273 AD, and this one arrived from a direction the Ptolemies never could have anticipated. It didn't come from Rome, it came from the Syrian desert. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was falling apart in ways that would have seemed impossible 100 years earlier. Historians now call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 50 years during which the empire cycled through more than 20 emperors, most of them murdered by their own armies, while barbarian invasions pressed against every frontier and entire provinces broke away to declare independence. One of those breakaway provinces was Palmyra, a wealthy trading city in what's now Syria. Its queen, Zenobia, seized on Rome's weakness to build something remarkable, a short-lived empire stretching from Anatolia through Syria and Egypt and reaching almost to the Bosporus. For a few years in the early 200s and 70s, she effectively ruled the entire eastern half of the Roman world from her palace in Palmyra. Alexandria fell under her control in 270 AD. The Alexandrians, based on their historical pattern of political flexibility, seem to have accepted her rule without much resistance. Zenobia herself was reportedly interested in Greek scholarship and may have even patronized what remained of the Mouseion during her brief period of control. Then Rome sent Aurelian. The Emperor Aurelian was, by any measure, one of the most militarily effective rulers Rome ever produced. In just 5 years on the throne, he reunified an empire that had seemed on the verge of permanent dissolution. He crushed the Gallic succession in the west. He defeated Zenobia's forces in a series of brutal campaigns across the eastern provinces. And when he arrived in Alexandria in 273 AD to reassert direct Roman control, the city made the same mistake it had made with Caracalla 60 years earlier. It resisted. The exact sequence of events is disputed by ancient sources, but the general shape is clear enough. Alexandrians, loyal to what remained of Zenobia's cause, fortified themselves in the Mouseion, the royal quarter of the city, the same district that contained the palace complex, the Mouseion, and the library. Aurelian's forces besieged them there. The Mouseion did not survive the siege. Ancient sources describe the destruction as comprehensive. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing about a century later, noted that the royal quarter of Alexandria was still visibly ruined in his own time. Walls left standing but hollowed out, palaces reduced to stone shells, entire streets abandoned to weeds and rubble. The Mouseion never recovered its former grandeur. It remained a wasteland at the heart of Alexandria for centuries, and the Mouseion sitting inside the Mouseion went down with the rest of it. Whether the library building itself burned, collapsed, or was simply looted and stripped by the besieging army isn't precisely documented. What is documented is that after 273 AD, the Mouseion effectively disappears from historical record. Later writers who describe Alexandria's intellectual life mention scholars, mention libraries in the plural sense, mention centers of learning still functioning in the city, but the specific institution founded by Ptolemy I, the one that had housed the great collection since the 3rd century BC, is gone. Whatever had survived Caesar's fire in 48 BC and Caracalla's abolition of scholarly stipends in 215 AD didn't survive Aurelian's siege. Here's the part worth paying attention to, though. Alexandria was not without books after 273 AD. The daughter library at the Serapeum, a smaller collection housed in a temple complex on a hill in a different part of the city, still existed. Private libraries owned by wealthy Alexandrians still existed. Christian communities were beginning to build their own libraries in monasteries and churches across the region. Roman North Africa still had functioning centers of learning at Carthage and elsewhere. The intellectual world of the Mediterranean didn't end when the Mouseion burned, but something specific and irreplaceable did end. The single greatest concentrated collection of ancient learning that had ever been assembled, the institution that had preserved and generated knowledge continuously for over 500 years, ceased to function as a unified whole. What remained after 273 AD was scattered, pieces of the original collection copied and dispersed across other libraries, individual works surviving in private hands, but never again gathered into anything like the Mouseion had been. And then, less than a century later, something arrived that nobody in Alexandria had planned for. It didn't come by land, didn't wear a Roman uniform, didn't announce itself with a proclamation. It came from the sea. Before we get to what actually killed the library, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through Caesar's harbor fire, Caracalla's massacre, Aurelian's siege, and a tsunami large enough to lift ships onto rooftops, you're the kind of person who wants a story that survives contact with the actual sources rather than the one that fits neatly onto a poster. That's exactly what this channel exists to make, and we put out something like this every single day. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means the next one just shows up. Now back to Alexandria. Because there's a 5th event most retellings of the library's destruction end on, and it's the version that made it into most history books, most documentaries, most casual conversations about how the ancient world's greatest collection was lost. It's also the version that turns out to be the most demonstrably fabricated. The story goes like this. In 642 AD, a Muslim army under the general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria as part of the early Islamic expansion. The Caliph Omar, the second successor to the Prophet Muhammad, allegedly issued a famous ruling when asked what to do with the vast collection of books housed in the city. If the books agreed with the Quran, he supposedly said, they were unnecessary. If they disagreed with it, they were harmful. Either way, they should be destroyed. According to the story, the scrolls were then used as fuel for Alexandria's public baths, and it reportedly took 6 months to burn through the entire collection. It's a dramatic ending. It's also almost certainly complete fiction. The story doesn't appear anywhere in the historical record until roughly 600 years after the events it claims to describe, first surfacing in the writings of a 13th century Christian historian named Ibn al-Kifti, who was living under Crusader-adjacent political conditions and had obvious reasons to portray earlier Muslim rulers as enemies of learning. No contemporary Arab source mentions it. No contemporary Christian source mentions it. No source of any kind from within a century of the alleged event mentions it. When Edward Gibbon, writing his monumental History of Rome in the 18th century, examined the story critically, even he, a man who never met a dramatic historical anecdote he didn't want to include, dismissed it as unreliable. Modern historians almost universally agree with Gibbon on this one. The Caliph Omar story was almost certainly invented centuries after the fact for political and religious reasons, and it has stuck in Western imagination, because it provides exactly the kind of clean, satisfying villain the actual history of the library refuses to offer. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth this entire investigation has been circling. The Library of Alexandria wasn't killed by any single event, or any single person, or even any single force. It was killed by something considerably more mundane and considerably harder to accept. It was killed by neglect. By the time you add up everything we've walked through, the loss of warehouse stocks in 48 BC, the dissolution of the scholarly community in 215 AD, the destruction of the Mouseion in 273 AD, the tsunami damage in 365 AD, you're looking at a pattern that spans over 400 years. That's not a catastrophe. That's a slow abandonment. Empire after empire, ruler after ruler, decided that the funding required to keep the library alive was money better spent elsewhere. The scholars who had once been supported by the Ptolemaic crown were expected, under Roman rule, to fend for themselves. The copying work that had kept the collection fresh, because papyrus decays, because scrolls literally crumble if they aren't remade every few generations, simply stopped happening at institutional scale. Books that weren't copied died on their shelves. Not dramatically, not visibly, just quietly, one at a time, over centuries. Modern scholars estimate that of the roughly 400,000 scrolls the library may have held at its peak, the overwhelming majority were lost not to fire or flood or ideological purge, but to the simple biological fact that papyrus doesn't last. A neglected library is a dying library, whether anyone notices or not. And Alexandria's library was neglected for a very long time before it stopped existing. Here's the part that sits uncomfortably with our modern instincts. We tend to want history to work like a movie. Clear turning points, clear villains, single moments when everything changed. The actual death of the Library of Alexandria refuses to cooperate with that expectation. There was no single moment. There was no single villain. There was just centuries of nobody quite caring enough to keep it alive. Which raises an obvious question worth sitting with, even for those of us with no personal stake in ancient Egyptian scholarship. What are we neglecting right now, quietly, while everyone assumes someone else is handling it? So here's where all of this actually leaves you. You came into this video with an image of the Library of Alexandria burning in a single terrible night, probably at the hands of Julius Caesar, definitely as a clean cinematic tragedy with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's the version everyone knows. That's the version that gets referenced in movies and speeches and articles about the fragility of civilization. Almost none of it is true. You now know Caesar's fire probably burned a warehouse, not the library. You know Caracalla's response to a joke was to abolish the community of scholars who kept the collection alive. You know Aurelian's siege in 273 AD leveled the district the Mouseion sat inside, and that whatever the library had been by then, it did not exist after. You know the tsunami of 365 AD flooded a city already struggling to keep its remaining collections intact. And you know the story about a Muslim caliph burning the last of the scrolls to heat public baths is almost certainly a lie invented 6 centuries after the fact by people with reasons to lie. 4 real events over 400 years. 1 fabricated event tacked onto the end by later chroniclers who preferred a villain to the truth. And underneath all of it, the actual force doing the killing, indifference, institutional decay, the simple failure of one generation after another to fund the copying that would have kept papyrus scrolls alive past their natural lifespan. The Library of Alexandria didn't die on a specific night. It died over centuries. In a way so gradual that by the time anyone in Alexandria noticed the collection was truly gone, there was nobody left to mourn what had specifically been lost. That's the part worth sitting with, more than any of the individual disasters. Because we tell ourselves the myth of the single catastrophic fire for reasons that have almost nothing to do with what actually happened. The myth is comforting. It gives us a villain to blame and a moment to point at. It lets us imagine that if only that one specific night had gone differently, the ancient world's knowledge would still be with us. The real story doesn't offer that comfort. The real story says something considerably harder to look at directly. Civilizations don't usually lose their knowledge in dramatic single events. They lose it the way people lose almost everything else that matters. A little at a time, over decades, while everyone assumes there will be time to preserve what needs preserving later. Until later never quite arrives. The Ptolemies built something in Alexandria that had never existed before. Every book they could find, in every language they could translate, gathered under one roof, protected by an institution that paid scholars to read and copy and expand the collection continuously. It was one of the most audacious cultural projects any civilization has ever attempted, and it worked for a while. Long enough to change the world. Not long enough to survive 400 years of decisions to spend the money on something else. Modern estimates suggest we've recovered, at best, perhaps 10% of the written output of the ancient Mediterranean world. 90% of what those civilizations wrote, we will never read. Not because it was destroyed by fire or flood or ideology, because at some point, somebody stopped making copies. That's not a story about ancient history. That's a story about how loss actually works in every generation, everywhere. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day. The version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence, not the one that fits neatly onto a poster. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment. A real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what civilization, what forgotten institution, what quiet loss you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.